All right, it is 1:30 on the dot, so we will get started. I love seeing where everybody's joining us from. It warms my heart. I love it all across the US. Thank y'all for making time to join us today. My name is Lacey Hensley. I'm the director of the Institute for Coordinated Community Response, ICCR. We are a program of the Conference on Crimes Against Women, and it's my program manager, my compadre, Maya Prigin is waving to you guys. So we are the ICCR team, and we're super excited to have you on our monthly webinar. I see a lot of familiar names and places, so lots of friends out there. If you're joining us for the first time, we have these webinars monthly and would love for you to continue to join us. A little bit about ICCR. We are a project funded through the Office of Violence Against Women, focused on rural communities and working alongside rural communities to help them improve their systemic response to domestic violence. And we also have a training available outside of the monthly webinars. If you check out our website, we have some on-demand trainings, some great roll call trainings that are completely free to you to use for your own individual education or to help facilitate a training in your community. Topics like strangulation, stalking, sexual assault, all kinds of training. So we would love for y'all to check those out. And we also have a wonderful resource library as well. So today, another thing that makes my heart really happy is that our friend Jordyn Lawson, who is our Chief Residential Officer at Genesis Women's Shelter, for those of you that may not know, our conference is the Conference on Crimes Against Women is actually a program of Genesis Women's Shelter and Support in Dallas, Texas. And so I will let Jordyn take it away. Let me stop sharing and I will let you introduce yourself and tell everyone a little bit about you. Thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thank you.
Please put questions in the chat. I forgot to mention that. Would love for y'all to ask questions throughout today's presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Lacey. Let me get my thing rolling. How's that? We good there? So it's nice to be here. Thank you, Lacey, for having me. I've done this presentation for Conference on Crimes Against Women before, and that was a lot of fun and a really good conversation. So I'm really excited to just be continuing this and having it today. A little bit different format, of course, because unfortunately can't hear any of you, but so I'll be doing the best that I can to monitor the chat box. Would really encourage you and love you to utilize it for any questions or any comments that you might have. Like I said, I'll be doing the best I can to monitor it while also asking for Lacey and Maya to monitor it and interrupt me if there's anything, because I don't know about you guys, I have been in this field for a long time now. I've been here in this work for about 18 years. That's a long time. Every time I say it, it kind of blows me away. But, you know, these days when I go to a training, especially if you're going to give me an hour and a half of your time, I very much personally want to walk away from the training with something to do, something that I feel like I can really implement and I can really apply immediately. And so my goal today is to really make sure that I'm providing information that you all feel like, you know, there's at least one thing you want to do differently, or you want to add, or you want to sort of think about how you might build upon, right? And so I think because of that, I want to make sure that I'm making sense and that I'm answering your questions and also hearing from you and the ideas that you're using, right? And that we're swapping ideas or even just contact information to get more information. So use that chat box. Feel free to interrupt me at any time. I will watch it. Lacey and Maya will interrupt me and let me know if there's anything there that I'm not catching that I need to answer. But I will for sure make sure that we have time at the end to also come to any questions. If you're just somebody that wants to hold off and make sure at the end that it's there, I'll make sure that that's there too. So just a little bit about me. I thought, you know, in order to talk about shelter services and the utilization of shelter services, I thought that it might just give me a little credibility if I shared with you that I got some experience in shelter work. I started off at Women's Protective Services in Lubbock, Texas, right out of Texas Tech University, Recom Tech, in case anybody in the chat might be also a Red Raider. But I started off as a hotline worker, just taking those frontline calls, eligibility screens for clients coming into shelter, doing the intakes, you know, driving an hour into the middle of nowhere to pick up a client, bringing them in, doing all the intakes, getting the beds made, getting them into the rooms. You know, I've been there, definitely those boots on the ground, frontline services for a while. I then got into case management work as a children's case manager, a little bit of adult case management, but ultimately decided I wanted to be a therapist. So I went and got my master's degree, got myself to Genesis, and worked as a individual and group therapist for adults and children who have experienced intimate partner violence or been exposed to intimate partner violence. And within that, I then became an assistant clinical director, and then my CEO, Jan Langbein, who I think is one of the smartest women ever, came to me one day and said, hey, would you want to be over the residential services? Didn't even think about going back to shelter life, wasn't even aware that I might want it, but she asked me and I just couldn't get it out of my head because I had loved shelter work so much when I first started off. So I'm now the chief residential officer for Genesis, as we talked about, and oversee our residential campus. Our residential campus consists of a 24-hour crisis helpline that is also text enabled, a 8-week emergency shelter, and then a 6-month to year-long transitional living program. So both the transitional living and the shelter are on the same campus, 2 different buildings, 2 different programs. But within those programs, we offer case management or advocacy services. We offer trauma counseling. We offer occupational therapy. We have an on-site childcare, and we actually have an on-site school so that our clients who are in shelter in particular have a safe place to put their kids in school while they're staying with us. So lots of experiences when I first came on as director of shelter, kind of looking at how we were doing things, really coming in with that trauma-informed therapist brain, to be honest with you, and really looking at things and just questioning, like, so what's the reason for this? What's the purpose for this? And hearing a lot from our clients. I mean, from our clients, yes, but also from our staff of, well, it's how we've always done it. It's the way it's always been, right? Which I definitely experienced back at WPS as well. So I started to really question how we were doing things and started to explore changes that we might be able to make in becoming trauma informed within our shelter program. But to be really honest with you, that journey of trying to make sure that how we're providing residential services is trauma informed and is as supportive as possible for our families has also really led me sometimes to question whether or not all women who come into our shelter should have come into our shelter. And so I just want to be really upfront with that from the beginning. I want to tell you that I am incredibly proud of the residential services that I provide, that Genesis provides, and that I know you guys are providing. I'm really proud of how many shelters there are out there that are just making it work with limited to no budget, hardly at all, right? That we are just trying to be that safe space for a woman to escape to, or for a victim of violence to escape to. And what I'm also really aware of is that there's been a history of the domestic violence movement. It's a short history. I'm going to show you that in a minute, but there's been a history of shelter within our movement. And I have the question of whether or not a referral to shelter is the most effective strategy as an intervention for somebody who's experiencing domestic violence or intimate partner violence. Like I talked about, I'm incredibly proud of the services that I offer and that you guys offer, those of you that are on here that are shelter workers. But I want to be really honest and really upfront about the pros and cons of shelter services. I want us to all be really aware of when we're making referral for shelter, what does that mean really holistically for that family, so that we can really step back and question whether or not this is the best referral for her. I'll give you sort of the whole crux of the presentation right off the bat. In my experience and opinion, a referral to shelter services is an automatic when domestic violence is mentioned. We have trained hospital nurses in the ER. We have trained the CPS system. We have trained police. We have trained neighbors. We have trained churches in some ways to hear whether a woman is experiencing domestic violence, to be a safe place for her to come and say, hey, I'm experiencing this in my home, I'm not safe. And their automatic referral, the limited experience and or training they have in how to help her, is usually okay, send her to a shelter. My hotline receives around 150 calls a day asking about shelter services. And those calls are usually a woman who's calling saying, this is what I'm going through. I don't feel safe in my home. I need to come to shelter. And when we start asking questions about it, we really are aware of the fact that she hasn't been told any other option. She hasn't been given any other path or experience. A lot of times when she's referred to us, she will say, they told me to come into shelter, right? Or CPS will say, you know, these kids have been exposed to intimate partner violence. Mom needs to get them safe, so she should go into shelter. So a huge part of this conversation that we want to have today is kind of the argument that shelter services have become sort of an automatic, habitual referral for a lot of our community partners or even for us. And I would like to really encourage us to educate the community, to educate ourselves, to get really clear in what's the best intervention for an intimate partner violence by slowing down and saying, is shelter the best referral for her right now? And then when we do talk about that, I do want to have some clear information for you guys on when somebody would absolutely need shelter versus when would somebody maybe not be the most appropriate referral for shelter, but then what do we do? How do we help her? What's the option there, right? So this kind of lays out what we're going to talk about. I see in the chat box that a lot of you are from a lot of different states, which is really cool and really exciting. I'm going to use Texas as an example because this is all different in all different states. If you'll give me for a second to just talk about Texas and my agency a little bit specifically, but apply it to your states as well, because what we know is that the DV movement is a very young movement. But if I were to look at Texas history, and if I were to really try to think about what is the influence on where the movement has come from, what is the influence of where we were, what we fought really hard to get as support services for victims of domestic violence, where have we come from that may be impacting how we do our services today or where we're at in the movement now. These are some important historical moments that I sort of came up with. Of course, they are not complete in everything. These are just some basic ones for the sake of the conversation today, right? So one of the things that was interesting that I found was there's evidence even back to the 1600s of women taking victims of domestic violence and hiding them within convents and within safe shelters. And so the idea of sheltering women from the experience of domestic violence, we know it goes back even further than the 1600s probably, just because we take care of, there's always been women taking care of women, right? But the evidence goes back clearly to the 1600s of this kind of shelter idea, get her out and hide her, right? And if you look at the reason why, if we're thinking about the 1600s, even up, through the 1700s, we'll keep talking about this, unfortunately, until very, very close into our current day. The laws were not there to protect women, and they were actually laws that prevented her from leaving, right? In the 1600s, women were considered property of their husbands. So it was illegal for her to leave. If she went to leave, her husband had the right to get her, and he had the right to punish her, right? In 1767, in England, the rule of the thumb is passed, which says that women need discipline. This is a religious law that implies that women actually need to be disciplined because it helps us. It keeps us in line. It's good for our development, right? But not too much. So if you had to beat your wife to discipline her, to keep her in line, that's okay. The bruises just can't be thicker than your thumb. You can't hurt her too bad is kind of what the rule of thumb was, right? So the laws were not in protection of women. They were against the safety of women back here. The need to get her and hide her from this violent person who had rights over her and her body were very much the truth during these times, right? In Texas in 1877, Martha McWhorter opens up a shelter in Belton, Texas. The cool story about this, I say cool, it's awful, but the story about this shelter is that there used to be bullet holes all out on the outside of the shelter of the actual building because men would drive by and shoot at the house and either because they were looking for their wife or just because they knew Martha was hiding women and hiding wives, excuse me. So in 1875, again, we're looking at this evidence of sort of formal shelter services. In 1910, the Supreme Court denies the right of a wife to prosecute her husband. The court said that it would just be too complicated. It would open up too many rules, so she can't really actually prosecute her wife. So it's not until 1920 that domestic violence starts to be illegal in the United States. But of course, we know that when something is considered illegal, it takes time for the different states to ratify it and or to start applying it. So whether or not it was enforced as being illegal continues to be a problem, even to this day, I guess we could argue, right? In 1973, the first shelter opens up in the US, and then from this point on, there's really a boom in shelter services. And I think the point of this being there's a boom in shelter services and an emphasis on shelter services, right? 1976, 6 Women Meet in Austin. They open up a shelter and they start fighting for funding for there to be more shelters throughout the state of Texas. We now know this to be the Texas Council on Family Violence is what it becomes. And it's really cool because it's a huge part of why we are able to say that we have so many shelters. And I see a lot of representation of that within the chat box and how many of you are here, right? But again, that emphasis on shelter. If you look at the funding from the 1980s to the early 2000s, there's a lot of legislation that's being funded and a lot of legislation that's passing that is offering legal protections from women, right? Protective orders, restraining orders, legislation regarding eviction or being able to change her cell phone number. Things like this start to get legislated while at the same time, a vast majority of the funding that's going towards victims of domestic violence are going specifically towards shelter services. In 1985, Genesis Shelter is opened. We were opened because there was a woman with 4 kids who was living in her car that went to the local homeless shelter to get dinner, and she kept coming and they asked her what she needed and why she was living out of a car. She told them she was trying to escape her husband, who was incredibly abusive, and they actually couldn't find a safe place in the Dallas area for her to go to with her children. At that time, the homeless shelter didn't allow children. You guys know that that's common in shelters for homeless women. There is this sort of, there are some of them that don't allow children. The ones that we had did not allow children. So they decide to open up their own, right? In 1994, we actually Genesis starts to move to non-resident services. So we actually start to see that we're getting a whole bunch of phone calls for help from women who are wanting to leave abusive partners, but they don't want to come into shelter or they're not yet ready to come into shelter. So we actually open up our outreach offices or our non-resident services where we offer advocacy, we offer legal services, we offer counseling, both group and individual for kids and adults. We now offer occupational therapy, right? We're doing this at an outreach office, non-resident services, meaning by appointment. They don't live with us. They come for these appointments, for this information, for this education, for these services and these options, right? And up until today, in all honesty, right now, we are the vast majority of services that Genesis provides in our community are through our outreach offices, are through our non-residential services. We actually have 2 locations, one in Dallas off of Harry Hines and Lucas, and then a second one in Southern Dallas off of Lancaster and Ledbetter. So 2 non-residential locations. And so the numbers, this is a rough kind of average, but on average every year we serve about 3,000 women and children out of our outreach offices. And our shelter, because of its size, because of its fullness, right? We're constantly full. That's something we'll get to, and I know that's something you guys experience too. We serve around a little more than 300 women and children on an annual basis. So you can see the difference in our ability to provide care being a lot higher out of our outreach offices than our shelter services. And the reason or the thought behind sharing that with you, I'll get to in a second. I did a little bit of stat looking up too, because I wanted you guys to see that I looked at the DV counts report. So my shelter participates in the DV counts every year. We just did it, I think it was like last week or 2 weeks ago or something. I've lost track of time. I'm sure a lot of you have done that too. But what it is where 1,958 different agencies were identified as offering services to victims of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And of those almost 2,000 agencies, 75% of them reported offering shelter services, while only 43% of them reported offering advocacy or case management for long-term housing or traditional housing. I thought this was important. Again, if what we're talking about is shelter really the best referral to her? The argument that I'm making is that shelter has become an automatic referral. It's become sort of a habitual systemic referral, but maybe not necessarily the most effective. And to be honest with you, I'm also proposing that shelters like mine, agencies like mine, and maybe even yours, really need to explore what our community needs, where we're at with the needs of the community, and is it that we should be directing the vast majority of our funding and our energy and all of that on shelter, or is it that we should be offering more than 43% of us should be offering more in regards to stability, long-term housing, long-term transitional housing, where there's supportive services for the sake of getting into stability and that sort of long-term safety approach, right? Okay, so this is the part where I really want to be really open and honest with you. This is also the part where I want you to chat in if you have any comments or any thoughts, or if you have any questions about this, right? But again, I'm going to be repetitive on this, so I'm just going to apologize now. You're going to hear this over and over. But again, the question is, does referring her to shelter meet her needs? Is it the most appropriate way to serve her and help her in this moment? And so in order to answer that, I think we got to be really honest about what would be the pros of referring somebody to shelter, how would it immediately help them, versus what would be the cons. Are there ways in which it might be counterproductive? Are there ways in which it might make things harder for her? They might compound trauma symptoms or expose her to new trauma and things that are going on in shelter. So when I looked at my shelter services, I wanted to be really transparent with you on what I see within my shelter as pros and reasons for her to come, and cons, reasons for her to consider not coming to shelter, right? So pros, the truth of shelter is that it is immediate safety. The idea of getting her out and hiding her in a shelter does mean that on a daily basis, she's not literally standing in front of her abuser and in danger of being punched or in danger of being strangled. And that's, or raped or yelled at or called names, right? That is true and that is important. Shelter should be an immediate escape from domestic violence, immediate safety, right? I'm also aware that I have support staff on campus. I'm sure all of your programs, those of you who are shelter workers on here, also have support staff on your campuses. So it's that immediate ability to meet with people and that convenience of she's not having to go to a building by appointment that she has to have transportation to, or another time in her day that is already really packed and busy and chaotic to get to the appointment, right? The fact that we are in her, at my shelter, the rooms are upstairs above me right now, and we're downstairs. Or when I was at WPS, our offices were in this building, and the buildings kind of in the backyard were where the clients stay. So the idea that we are right here downstairs or in the backyard are really true, right? So staff is right there to help her. There is truth to and reality to the positivity of getting immediately safe means she could have a de-escalation of fight, flight, or freeze that would allow her brain to really calm down. If you know about the impact of trauma or threat on the brain, you know that the part of the brain back here that's the reactive part of the brain is really triggered by threat. And in that moment, she is making choices to survive out of a fight, flight, or freeze kind of a behavioral reaction, right? What we know about the problematic side of fight, flight, or freeze is that in those moments where she is reacting out of the back part of her brain, she does not have access to and is not able to utilize the front part of her brain, the part of her brain that's really needed to assess her situation, to consider next steps, to really look at consequences. If I do this, then this will happen. If I go here, then I'll lose this and I won't have this. What she's needing to be able to work through that process and that decision making is her prefrontal cortex, her front part of her brain. And unfortunately, when somebody's in fight, flight, or freeze mode, the brain literally cuts off their ability to be logical, to think things through. It wants to be reactive and quick. It doesn't want to waste time thinking and being too logical. And so it cuts down, it literally shuts down the ability for somebody to utilize that part of their thinking, which means when somebody's coming into shelter, they may be reacting in the moment, survival of the moment, but not really able to consider long-term choices, long-term impact, right? The pros of this in the de-escalation of fight, flight, or freeze means once she gets into shelter, if her brain can really sense that she's safe, if we're predictable and we're consistent and we're a safe place and we can really help her neurosystem calm down, then she gets that front part of her brain back and she can start working with a case manager and thinking about what she wants her next steps to be. She could be thinking about relocating or applying to different housing projects or what job she might want to do. She might be able to be more effective at her job and keep her job because she has the front part of her brain so she can work better. So getting her to immediate safety could mean that it's helping her get out of that flight, fight, or freeze survival response. And that's a good thing. That means it could be helpful to her, right? She gets to focus on her goals. She gets to be independent. She gets to actually start considering what she wants from her life, what she wants to do for herself, or where she wants things to change, how she wants them to be different without her abuser being right there and being a threat and being, a barrier and a block to that if she's in shelter potentially, right? All of those are good things. All of those are important things. They are all things that victims of domestic violence need and potentially could really help. But there is also truth to the other side of this. And that's why I want to put it out there to talk through for a second. Because again, if we're considering sending somebody to shelter, let's know what could possibly impact her when she goes into shelter. In my experience, shelter can also be a time where somebody's trauma symptoms increase. There is this idea that when she gets safe, her flight, fight, or freeze symptoms could de-escalate. But on the other hand, as a trauma therapist, what I will tell you that we see both in observation and interaction, but also in the assessments that we provide in shelter, is that once she gets in and the brain sort of calms down and knows that it's in a safe place, there is sort of this tendency for symptoms to really increase. That may be symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety, intrusive thoughts, not being able to sleep and having her sleep interrupted. And in that, because shelters do have a limited amount of time that she can stay typically, those can be very difficult for her to be able to take next steps to plan where she's going to go after shelter. So that escalation of trauma symptoms is something that not only I want us to be aware of, but prepared to even support her in if she is going to come to shelter. The truth is that if she's in shelter, she is going to continue to be exposed to domestic violence. She's going to continue to be exposed through the other clients, through on here you see communal living issues. And those of us that work in shelters know that communal living issues are a really hard part and a reality of shelters, that trying to have a house full of people who are in the most stressful time of their life and the most anxious time of their life, where they're the most afraid, they're the most concerned, they're the most worried about what they're going to do next, means that you're going to have some of these moments of conflict that happen. And those could continue to be ongoing trauma triggers that she's experiencing, ongoing issues. I'll talk about power and control in a minute, but just to be blatantly honest with you about what that means, what I'm talking about there is the fact that shelters innately have power and control. When the decision of whether or not somebody comes in or not is on us to decide, she can't just choose. We get to decide if she's, eligible enough for our services. There's power and control. My shelter serves 3 meals a day. We are grateful to be able to do that because we see that as a way of supporting the client by removing burdens of having to financially afford the food or time to cook the food or anything. We're like, let's take this stress off your plate and we'll just give you food. But there's power and control in that, because that means we're deciding what she has to eat for dinner every single day, right? You might have a shelter where you provide hygiene products, or you provide laundry detergent, or you provide over-the-counter medication, or maybe you're a shelter who locks up all the medication, and so they have to come to you and ask for their medicine, and then you can give them their medicine, right? Those are not necessarily bad, but they are inherently power and control. She's having to come and ask for things and depend upon us, hope that we're in the mood or the whatever, say, yes, you can have more. Yes, you can have those things. So that power and control dynamic in shelters, it exists always. I'm doing everything I can to limit that where I can, and to make sure that the rules that we have are necessary for safety and for the well-being of the community. But power and control is going to be a part of it. There's no way for me to get rid of it completely, right? And so I want to be aware of that, so that if a client's coming in, she maybe even gets to know ahead of time, hey, this is going to be a part of it. I'll give you an example. When clients call our helpline to talk about coming into shelter services, they are then really taken through a conversation of, okay, here's what shelter's like. If you're going to decide to come in with us, we just want you to be prepared for a few things. And so, for example, they'll talk about that, for the sake of safety of the building, we set the alarm at 11 p.m. every night. If you're going to be out past 11 p.m., you have to call us, and it may be a minute for us to be able to turn off the alarm and let you in, but we want you to be prepared that that is a dynamic of coming and going, right? We have quiet hours for the sake of the community. And so asking you to be quieter after 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. on the weekends is going to be a thing. So we try to head that off in the helpline call, in the hotline call, by saying, this is going to be a part of your stay. Are you okay with that? Is this what you're wanting to come to? And really just trying to call that out and try to give her a little bit back some of that empowerment by letting her have the choice and letting her come in. Because like I said, even if we're trying to be as trauma informed as possible, there is going to be power and control that we just can't 100% get rid of, I think, because the idea of whether or not she still gets to sleep there each night may be upon a shelter director or somebody in within the shelter stay, right? One of the things that I have seen oftentimes, more often than not, to be honest with you, is that coming into shelter could actually contribute to her being destabilized more than it's contributing to her becoming stable. What I mean by this is, a lot of times, because she wants to leave this abusive home, she's going, and somebody said, hey, you should leave, you should go to shelter. She comes straight from this home to us, and then she has 8 weeks. 8 weeks is all we can offer. There's argument of whether or not we should offer more than 8 weeks. And I'm willing to have that conversation with you guys at one point to sort of explain our mindset about behind it. But for right now, the reality is 8 weeks, right? So in 8 weeks, she's going to have to decide where she's going to go next, and find housing, and find a safe place for her and her children, maybe even find the income to be able to afford the housing. Well, I don't know about your communities, but to be really transparent, Dallas-Fort Worth is in a housing crisis. We do not have enough housing for the amount of people that are in our community. The stat that I have heard is that we only have one housing space for every 4 individuals, right? So we literally do not have enough housing. That obviously is contributing to then rental rates and housing prices skyrocketing. I know you guys know this. I'm speaking to the choir. But then you've got issues of trying to get into the apartment, and the deposit has gone up 3 times what it normally is. Or they want their credit score to be at a certain level, or they want them to be able to pay first and last months or 3 months rent or something. And so all of this has made it a lot harder for a victim, even with employment, to come into shelter and then in 8 weeks be able to move into her own apartment. We in the Dallas-Fort Worth area have other agencies that we work with for housing options, including rapid rehousing options. Well, I'll be really transparent with you. Right now, rapid rehousing is taking 6 to 10 months. And so that's a lot longer than my shelter stay. And so I want to be really aware of all of this when I'm considering referring her to shelter or having a conversation with her in shelters. Where is she going to go at the end of 8 weeks? What I often see is women are told you should go to shelter. They call our hotline, they say I need to come into shelter. We make sure to say on the hotline call that we cannot guarantee housing after the 8 weeks. We will start working with you on a plan. We'll do applications with you. We'll start offering as many things as we can, but we cannot provide housing after the 8 weeks. So she'll come in potentially still. And then at the end of 8 weeks, what we're seeing a lot of is her having to exit into another shelter, or having to exit to a friend's house or a family member's house and then jump around to different houses to be able to stay. And so that destabilization, we just compounded on top of the domestic violence, homelessness on top of her, right? Chronic homelessness in a lot of ways is what I'm seeing, because I've had some clients even recently come in who've been trying to find housing for a year and a half, 2 years, and they've just been going shelter to shelter because they haven't been able to get into housing, right? We talked about communal living. We talked about the length of the program, right? This experience of financial abuse, right? 93 to 99% of victims of domestic violence report experiencing financial abuse. I always want to argue that I think that number has to be 100%, but some women don't know how to recognize some things that are going on. But the most effective way to have power and control over somebody is to make them literally dependent upon you for their physical needs to be met, whether they have somewhere to live, whether they can eat, whether they can have the lights on, is the way to maintain control over them or to disrupt that. Of course, we know there's a lot of clients who are working 2-3 jobs, but he's taking the entire paycheck, and he's kind of choosing what it gets spent on and whether the bills get paid and anything there, right? And so that reality, the reality that so many of the women and victims that we are interacting with are experiencing financial abuse, it has to be a part of the conversation and the thought process of whether or not she should come into housing, to shelter right now, of does she have the income, does she have the resources to be able to have somewhere to go at the end of the 8 weeks? Do we have any steps that we could take where we could be able to get her access to that income or get her access to more income or anything before she comes into shelter so that she has that? Because what we're seeing is a lot of victims, even the ones who are working, I have a house right now where majority of the clients that are in house are working. I got a couple of clients that again have 2-3 jobs, but they didn't have access to their, he also had access to their checking account. And so he was taking the funds out. And so really looking at that and going, okay, is 8 weeks, is the shelter that's in your area, is their stay, their amount of time, is that enough time for her to gain control over that, for her to get the income, for her to have this, to be able to be stable and go into the next safe place? I see a chat, Anastasia, you asked how frequently are the women who have nowhere to live after 8 weeks going back to the person that caused them harm? I think that's a really important point because we do see that, honestly. And so we work with them as much as possible to get into the nuts and bolts. We do extensions, we do work with them on certain things, but if I'm just being real specific on if they didn't have housing after 8 weeks, where would they go? I think the fact that she has to consider going back to her abuser is important for us to acknowledge as reality. If she literally needs 4 walls and a roof to be able to take care of herself and take care of her kids, and she can't get it independently, there's not enough time for her to come up on the housing list in your community or to qualify for this program in your community, then she may have to consider going back to the abusive partner. And to go back to the abusive partner means she has to acquiesce more control to him to be let in. She has to be sorry. She has to be give him what he wants to be, let back in a lot of times. And so she's in more danger when she went back than even before she left. And I think that's an important part. So I appreciate you saying it, Anastasia, of the conversation that we're having. If the question is, should she go to shelter? Or if the question is, should she go to shelter right this second, right now, right? I think this is an important question to talk to her about and to think about. If she didn't have anywhere to go at the end of the shelter stay, would she have to go back to her abuser? Because if that's the case, then we may need to do some things before she goes into shelter or explore some other options, because this is definitely something that's happening, in all honesty, that's happening, that is making the victims be more in danger than it is contributing to their safety. We talked about affordable housing. Again, DFW is a mess, just to be really honest with you. We will, I will leave it to you to know about the housing in your community, but what I'm hearing on a federal level, what I'm hearing across the US is that housing and affordable housing is a major issue in all of our areas. So it's just something to take into consideration. If you'll give me 2 seconds, I'm going through the chat box so I can make sure and see if there's anything else. Oh, yes, Shannon is on it. She could do this presentation too. That's where I'm going here, Shannon. So thanks for being with me, right? So what we've been talking about, if we're being blatantly honest about the pros of why she should, what would benefit her to going to shelter, but if we're just being very transparent and honest about the potential risk or the cons of her going into shelter, then I also want us to really step back. If we're going to be honest about shelter, I also want us to be honest about ourselves. And I want us to step back and I want us to really think and really question, are we referring to shelter? If you are in connection with CPS in your area or hospitals in your area or schools or churches, places that if somebody came to them and said, hey, I'm a victim of domestic violence, I need help, places that might go, oh, you should go to shelter. Are we really educating them or even educating ourselves on whether or not that's the best referral, the only referral in your area, or are we doing that because it is an immediate intervention? It is the quickest way of kind of, for lack of a better word, fixing the problem for that night that we have. Again, the good thing about shelter, the reason that shelters are needed is because it's an immediate escape from intimate partner violence. But the question is it that we are referring her because it's what she needs? She needs an immediate escape from domestic violence. Or is it because we don't know, we don't have other awareness of other referrals? We haven't educated ourselves in all the other agencies in our community or in how to refer appropriately? Is it that we're afraid for her? She comes to me, she tells me this really hard story. Maybe she even has injuries. Maybe she has visible injuries. And I'm like, oh my gosh, she's really in danger. I'm really worried about her. And it makes me feel better to say, okay, well, she's going to go to shelter tonight. She'll be okay, right? If I can just get her in and get her over there, they'll help her and they'll take care of her, right? I want to gently put that out there because I think that is happening a lot. A lack of knowing how to refer, a lack of knowing community resources, and then a lack of being able to be uncomfortable for a little bit so that in a long-term strategy, we can actually help her. In my experience, that's what's contributing to this. Victims of domestic violence come to people and they might not know, right? They're in their fight, fight, or freeze brain. They're just trying to survive the night. And so when somebody says you should go to shelter, that's what they're doing. They don't know how to consider all these things. So I think it's important for us to be aware that we may need to re-educate our systems. We may need to re-educate ourselves. We may need to explore what other options there are out there. We may need to create those other services, those other options, so that when she comes to us, we can slow her down and give her options, give her strategies and say, well, you could do this, but this could happen. You could do this, but this could happen. You could do this and this, so that we're being more long-term strategic than we are being immediate, right? I look at this and I wanted to take a second within this conversation too, to just acknowledge that there are some other reasons to be aware of why shelter services may not be as helpful for a victim as possible, right? So we might need to be aware of what are the barriers to her leaving and gaining independence? Like, why hasn't she been able to do that independently? We know that if she could, she would. She's been doing that. So before we say, hey, go to shelter, let's find out what those barriers are. One, because we may be able to help her meet those independently. It may take a little bit more time than just going into shelter, but we may be able to help her overcome those barriers. Two, those might be really important barriers that are going to affect her in shelter and are going to stand in the way of her becoming independent in shelter, which means for 8 weeks, she won't be able to make progress on some of her goals because of these things. And that might be lack of employment, that might be lack of documentation or status, that might be a physical ailment that she has or a physical limitation that she has, that might be different things that could affect why she can't be independent. And it may be true in shelter too. Shelter can't overcome all of those. So we want to be aware of what they are, right? We want to be aware of the cycle of violence. Have we talked to her about the fact that when she leaves is the most dangerous time for her? I participate in the Dallas County Fatality Review, and just yesterday we had a meeting and reviewed a couple of cases of homicides in our community where intimate partner violence, and in both cases, actually all three cases, it happened within a couple of weeks of her trying to end the relationship. And so we know it's the most dangerous time for her. So if we're going to be encouraging her to leave, are we being honest with ourselves and her about the reality that it could make her more in danger, that it would increase the abuse as far as text messages or posting on social media or calling her families or friends, or I've had a lot of clients where he typed up letters with all of this really disparaging information and emailed it to everybody at her work. Or in one case that I have, he typed up these letters and put it in the mailbox of everybody in the neighborhood that they lived in, right? So again, looking at and just being really aware of the escalation of violence when she comes in. The other thing that we can do is really help her understand the cycle of violence so that she can be careful and aware of when might be the right time to leave versus when might be a time of honeymoon, and she can be aware of the manipulative kindness in the honeymoon and aware of what's going on, and kind of be like, okay, during this time, I'm going to be working on these things. I'm going to be going to these appointments. I got these strategies, but I know that when the cycle comes around, do I have the ability in some way to kind of notice when things are escalating? And that's when I have to go to shelter. Now, let me call it out. We all know that this is not something that she can predict 100%. There is risk here because whether or not he's abusive is his choice. She's not making him be abusive. He decides whether he's going to be abusive, which means she can't stop him from being abusive. And so I think the truth of that is there's a risk here that it could obviously become violent at any time without her being able to predict it. But it is one of the things that we can do and that we can talk to her about is being able to strategically look at when she needs to go into shelter based on sort of the likelihood of times that things could be violent, right? We really want to have conversations with her about monitoring and isolation before she goes in too, right? Being aware of the fact that an abuser cannot have control over a victim without monitoring her. He has to know where she goes. He has to know who she talks to. He has to know what she does in order to control her. So if he knows all of those things, if she leaves and goes into the shelter, right, which now becomes the most dangerous time for her, does he still know all of her contacts, all of the people that she's going to call out and talk to? Does he know where she's going to work? Does he still know which way she drives every day? Does he know? And so again, just looking at that monitoring and really seeing, is going to this shelter in this community our safest bet? Do we need to refer and maybe talk about relocation opportunities or resources? Do we need to look at getting some legal stuff in place before she leaves? Because the moment she leaves, things are going to escalate and he's going to be aware of all of this information about her, right? We also know that isolation is an incredibly impactful part of domestic violence for every victim. That isolation is probably one of the first experiences of abuse that she starts to go through, because in order to control her and maintain that control, he has to cut off the influence of others and the resources and support from others, right? So that means she was isolated before she came into shelter, When she's in shelter, she's now even more isolated potentially because she's literally left the neighborhood. She's literally left some of the resources behind. She literally, in order to go to the shelter, had to go a couple of hours away. And so getting back and forth to her job is no longer something that she could do. So she might lose that resource, right? These are things that we need to be considering and thinking about before we decide if the shelter referral is what's best for her, right? We need to really look at and see that most likely abusers, there's nothing wrong with a victim who is victimized by an abuser. We know this. It is not her fault. But what we do know is that oftentimes abusers are looking for victims that have areas of vulnerability that they can manipulate, that they can prey upon, and that they can use to gain control over that victim. So maybe it's that she's a single mom and he knows this, and so she has limited income and she's got these kids and she needs help with them and all of this, and so he can come in like the savior and be friendly with these kids, and the kids love them, and that's going to pull her heartstrings, and that might be the strategy he has to get her really quickly, right? Maybe she has past trauma and he knows that she has a previous abusive relationship, and so he comes in really acting like the best guy ever, and he's going to save her and he's going to take care of things, and he's really coming in as like the next guy who's going to be so much better than the previous guy. Maybe he's purposely using these things to get in really quick and to get control of her really quick, right? If she has mental health, he's coming in saying that he's going to help her and he's going to support her. Maybe that mental health is organic. Maybe regardless of trauma, she was going to be experiencing anxiety or depression because of chemical levels within her neurosystem and her brain, right? And so those are the things that he comes in and takes advantage of. We want to know this because those are the areas that will still be true for her when she comes into shelter, and she'll be more vulnerable in those moments for him to sort of, for lack of a better way of saying it, manipulate her in the honeymoon phase and promise that things will get better, and kind of try to hook her back in, right? They could also make her more vulnerable for other people who might be trying to prey upon her and take advantage of her. And so it's not that somebody who has these shouldn't go to shelter. What I'm suggesting is these are things that we need to be aware of as much as we can before she goes into shelter, so that we can plan for how to address these things in shelter. We can give a shelter the heads up so that they can address these things. If a client comes in and I only have 8 weeks, it may take several weeks to even gain this information and learn. And so it's several weeks that I'm not able to help her with this or overcome it, or it's just a limited amount of time then with what's left of our shelter stay, to be able to address some of these things. So to be able to sort of coordinate with your shelter ahead of time and say, these are her areas of needed support, can be really effective too, right? Maybe these are areas that we need to talk about that will always be true to her, right? So it'll always be true that she has certain mental health diagnosis. And so we need to look at outside partners and getting her established with as much support systems as possible, so that through shelter, even outside of domestic violence, she's getting support in all of these different areas. Okay, Shannon, I'm reading your comment real fast, if you guys will give me a second. Surprised and discouraged to realize the number of shelters do not provide services to survivors who are not in their shelter. Perhaps we can do some preemptive strikes and help facilitate a slow transition. Thank you, Shannon. I think this is my thing too. In throwing these numbers out, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say that our movement has focused a lot on shelter as the answer. And my argument is that I don't think shelter is always the answer. I think shelter can be really important and really helpful, but I think we have to be really intentional in when to use shelter and how to refer to shelter. And what I'm also suggesting is that a slow down process of, before you refer to shelter, maybe working on some of these resources or some of this planning or prepping, right? So that when they do come into shelter, it's more effective. And so I think that means, like you're suggesting, non-resident services, transitional housing for longer programs, right? Guys, this is what's called the stages of change. This is a really important part of my understanding and my work with victims of domestic violence. When I do a presentation on stages of change, I spend 2 hours just on this slide, to be honest with you. I do a lot of information on this, but so I don't have time to go into all of this right now. If you would like my information on how to get a presentation for your agency or for yourself on stages of change, I'd be more than happy for you to email me and let me know. But I wanted to just very quickly, admittingly, very quickly and briefly, throw this out here as something that needs to be considered. We know that there are 5 stages that somebody goes through when they are wanting to change an issue or a problem, right? And in these stages, a huge part of how they go through the stages, how they change the problem, is increasing in awareness, increasing in insight, and increasing in resources. And so if you look at this, stage 1 is the stage where we're coping through denial. We're not admitting that his behavior is abusive. We can say, hey, this happened, hey, this hurt, hey, this did, but we're not saying that it's domestic violence. We're not saying that it's abuse. We're not saying that this is something that will continue and needs to be addressed, right? In stage 2, somebody starts to actually recognize this as abuse and says there's a problem. The thing about stage 2 is that they've experienced so much disempowerment from their abuser that then when they're in a state of self-awareness of stage 2, they are not connecting what they can do to change the problem, what they can do to make things better. They're very much focused on, he's doing this, this is what he's doing. And so they come to us and they say, you need to make him stop. You need to give me housing. You need to do this. They're very focused on the problem, but not empowered in what they can do or need or might need to do for things to get better, right? In stage 3, this is when they start to be very aware of what abuse is. They're taking a lot of ownership in what they could potentially do, and they're starting to explore, you know, what if I were to do this? What if I were to relocate? What if I were to change this? What if I were to get a divorce and file for legal protections, right? But they're not entirely doing it yet. If you were to take eating healthy as an example of something that a lot of people want to change, I want to change. Stage 3 is like when you go to the grocery store and you buy the broccoli or the vegetables, you bring them home, you stick them in the fridge in the drawer, and then they rot in that fridge in the drawer. This has happened to me multiple times. I'm hoping that you can relate to that and not judge me, and that you also understand that that happens, because that's stage 3, that I do want to change. I am taking certain steps to maybe change, but I'm not actually changing yet because the vegetables rotted in the drawer, right? A lot of times this is clients who they want things to be better. They want their lives to be safer. They want to heal. They want to do these things, but they're not yet making a exit plan, or they're not yet seeking that legal order, or they're not yet doing that thing that would be the change, right? No judgment or shame in any of these stages. None of them are good or bad. They're just true, and they're an important impact on somebody when they're trying to consider changing their situation in the pieces that they can control, of course, of domestic violence. A lot of times people think that victims who come to shelters are in stage 3 or stage 4. They are in action because they are leaving and they want to be done, and so they're going to shelter. I wanted you to understand the majority of clients that I see come into shelter are stage 2. A lot are stage 1. They just wanted to be safe because this happened this night and I wanted to get safe and I wanted him to have time to cool down, but I haven't actually decided I want to end this relationship. I haven't actually decided I don't want to talk to him anymore. And so it's important for you to be aware of, if she's going to leave these 4 walls and a roof and potentially experiences the consequences of leaving these 4 walls and a roof, if she's not yet to a place where she's really committed and really aware of what it takes to move forward, she may be putting herself in a more dangerous situation because she can't have the insight yet. She can't, remember we talked about the prefrontal cortex, she can't consider those consequences yet. And so it's important for us to recognize where she's at in the stages of change and make referrals, make suggestions, or in our approach being appropriate based on that stage of change. It doesn't mean I don't refer to shelter. Maybe I do refer to shelter, but I'm really direct in, if you do this, here's the risk. If you do this, here's the consequence. If you were to leave and go here, this is what this means. And I just have to walk her through it more directly, and maybe slow down the referral process and having these full conversations rather than just saying, okay, here's a hotline, call them, they'll bring you in. Okay. So what we've been talking about is the reality of shelter services. Again, I want to emphasize it for all of us that are in shelter work in this call. I am not putting down shelter work. I am not saying that what we're doing is not life-saving and not important. It very much is. What I am suggesting is that the way that we're utilizing shelter oftentimes is not effective because we're quick to just say, go to shelter. And so what I've been trying to show you is the pros and the cons, the risks, the things to consider, the things to look at, and whether or not shelter is appropriate or shelter right now is appropriate. The other thing that I'm trying to show you is this idea of slowing down. That in my experience, because referring to shelter is a habitual thing or an immediate thing that a lot of people do, oh, DV, go to shelter. Maybe it's their lack of information on what referrals are out there. There's no time to prep or plan or give her informed consent and let her make an empowered choice for herself because we just immediately have her go to shelter. So I want to take a second to talk about if we were going to slow down and we were going to have this sort of planning for maybe even a long-term planning, meaning it takes more time than just get out right now. It takes more time to prep and plan before she leaves to ultimately get her out and get her to a safe and stable place. I want to walk through some areas that would be important to really consider. Safety planning being first. We safety plan anytime we talk to any victim of domestic violence. Safety planning, remember, is noticing what she's already doing to keep herself safe, emphasizing that and encouraging her to keep doing those things. And then it's potentially giving her more options and more ideas and more specifics on what she should be doing, right? We safety plan when she's living in the home for living in a home with domestic violence. We safety plan if she tells us she wants to leave. Okay, if you're preparing to leave, here are some things you could think about. Have you thought about where you'll go? Have you thought about who you'll tell? Have you thought about what time of day you'll leave? Have you thought about what you'll take with you, right? And then after she leaves, we safety plan because again, we know she's 75 times more likely to be seriously injured or killed. It's the most dangerous time for her. So we're continuing after she's left to safety plan and check in. How's it going? Do you have any safety concerns? Are there any signs that he's following you? Has he been texting you or monitoring you in any way? In all of these things that we're safety planning, we are guiding her in this leaving process and supporting her with the things that she's already doing, right? Because we know that our clients are resourceful and that they are doing everything that they can control to be safe oftentimes. But we're also providing new suggestions, providing more information of things that she might be able to do. We're emotionally safety planning, right? So what this talks about is the idea of if she has to stay longer in this situation while we're prepping, while we're planning for her to leave. So for example, you have a client that you're talking to, she wants to leave her abusive partner, so she wants to leave these four walls and a roof, but she has not yet identified the stable housing that she can go into. So you want to make sure that she has things together, and we're going to talk about what those things are here in just a second. But you want to do some of this preemptive kind of proactive planning and prepping before she leaves this four walls and a roof. What you're going to want to do is emotional safety plan for how does she stay in these four walls and a roof that are abusive, because his abuse will continue. Hear me acknowledge in this moment that that's probably the most uncomfortable thought and part of what we're talking about is in changing how we intervene with victims of domestic violence. We may be talking about encouraging them to stay in these four walls and a roof longer, which means being the risk of experiencing ongoing verbal or emotional abuse, the risk of experiencing potential physical abuse that she couldn't predict and happened, right? That's uncomfortable and that's true. And I'm not suggesting that that's okay. The fact that she's being abused is not okay. But if we're looking at it from how do we get her long-term tragedy-wise into the most stable situation so that she can get there and she can stay there and continue to be safe and not have to go back, as Anastasia brought up, then what we're asking to do is slow down and stay in this abusive relationship potentially while she's coming to our appointments, while we're prepping, while we're ordering birth certificates and driver's license and things like this, right? Emotional safety planning is things like, if he starts calling you names, what's something you can say in your head to take care of yourself? What's not toxic positivity, y'all, but sort of this reality of he's not the thing, he's manipulating me. He's not the things that he says that I am. My advocate says that I'm this, right? Or he tells me that I can't do this, that I'm not good enough, that I won't be able to do this. And so I remind myself, my advocate and I are working on this. Emotional safety planning is talking about what are ways you can distract yourself? What are things you can think of, like your grocery list or things when he's doing these, so that you're not taking in the things that are happening in the moment. Again, let me acknowledge, not perfect, because this is still happening to her, and that's horrific and awful. And if we could stop it dead in its tracks in a moment, that would obviously be the best case. But because we oftentimes can't make him stop, we may be talking to her through what are things that she can do to take care of herself while experiencing this, because at the same time, simultaneously, we are planning and taking steps to ultimately getting her away from the abuse and getting her safe. The other question that's within this always is, how would you know when it's not safe enough? Where would be the point that you would know, nope, I can't take this any longer. I got to get out now. Now is the time, regardless of my prepping, regardless of my plan. I got to leave now. I got to call the shelter. I got to get in my car and go to my sister's. I got to do whatever. A lot of times this answer comes from mental health. If she is experiencing active suicidal thoughts, if the experience of the abuse is starting to make her be suicidal, there's the potential that we need to get her out right then. If she is assigns, if you have the danger assessment or the lethality assessment you do in your community, and she's meeting certain marks that she's at risk of a homicide, we might need to get her out now, right? If her children are being directly physically abused and directly experiencing the abuse, we may need to get her out now and deal with all that other stuff that I talked about before, right? So I do think it's important to sort of balance this conversation of, how do you continue to take care of yourself in these four walls and a roof while we plan for the next thing? And then when would you know when you need to leave? When would you know that for sure this is no longer something that you can stay in? If we're looking at long-term exit planning, or getting a plan together to leave, what's the prep that you could do before somebody goes into shelter? These are the things that my team really identifies as being important. These are the things that my team really works on from our outreach perspective. So I am the chief residential officer. Kind of weirdly, I know titles are probably a thing in your agency too. The entire advocacy team or case managers falls under my supervision. And so we're working on these and we're talking about these all the time. This is an example of somebody's in our non-residential programming. Before they leave their abusive home, we want to talk about these things and we want to see how many of these we could get met before she leaves the four walls and a roof that are abusive, because then when she goes to the next thing, she's more likely to be stable. The next thing might be shelter. So a lot of times what my advocates are doing is they're working on these things with her non-residentially in a weekly appointments. She's working on these things with the point of, when she gets enough of them, whatever they are that the advocate and her think are necessary to go into shelter, or all of them or whatever, then she goes into shelter, and the shelter is a part of her plan. They're also coordinating with shelter. So they're calling me and saying, okay, we're taking this step. This is coming up. We're thinking this is the date she might be able to come into shelter. And I'm able to look at my shelter list and go, oh, okay, that works, because I actually have a planned exit on this date. So it means I could hold her room for her to come in that day and be able to bring her in. And so then it's that coordination of shelter as a part of the plan, but not a unplanned for and sporadic, maybe sporadic's the wrong word, but get out right now and go, right? So for example, if you're looking at income, if she's going to leave these four walls and a roof, she has got to have a source of income. I don't like it, but the reality of our world is you got to have money to survive, okay? And so what does she need? Does she need you to help her build her resume? Does she need you to help her apply for jobs? Does she need to do mock interviews with you so that she can practice going to the interview so that she can be successful in the interview and get the job, right? Does she need to actually start the employment and have some checks coming in? Does she need to have a plan of where those checks are going to go? Not automatically into the bank account that he has access to. Maybe opening another account that he doesn't know about. Maybe asking somebody who's safe in her life, like her sister or somebody, to hold the checks physically. But maybe the plan needs to be she's going to get a couple of checks under her belt and then she's going to go into shelter, right? So it's kind of saving or having something. Could we do some of the applications for WIC or for food stamps or for housing, right? To get her on certain housing lists or things. Could we actually do all of those applications before she leaves so that the time that it takes within that application process, maybe some of that time is planned for as those 8 weeks that she's going to be in shelter, right? But we've already done the application. The alternative to that is she comes into my shelter, she spends a couple of days, if not a week, sleeping and eating because she's exhausted from the abuse, which is completely understandable. And then we've got to try to apply for these things. And then it takes her weeks of being on the list. And we know the just frank truth of it is she's not going to be accepted in these housing programs in the time that my shelter stay is going to come up, right? Do we potentially need to start looking at what her experience of financial abuse is? Can we pull her credit report and see, oh, you actually do have a really low credit score because he has coercively put this debt on you, which means that you are going to have a hard time getting an apartment on your own because they're going to look at your credit score and deny you right away. So before she leaves these 4 walls and a roof, maybe we need to work on a credit score and argue some of these things. Maybe we need a legal referral. In the state of Texas, for example, Genesis is working with the Texas Appleseed Project on referrals to their legal program when there's been coercive debt, because it can actually count as identity fraud. Last legislative session, they passed a law that says that if he used her social security number to take out credit cards that she didn't know about, or he coerced her, made her fearful, so she did it to protect herself from the abuse, that actually might meet the legal definition of identity fraud, and she could get some relief from that debt on her credit report because of it, which means we could raise her credit score, hopefully help her potentially get into that apartment or get into that place, right? If a part of the financial abuse is that, again, he's monitoring your checking account, that's another example of us being like, okay, well, let's open another account, or let's not have money going into that account anymore. Getting really creative. And we know that victims are really resourceful and creative in how they're surviving. So we're adding to that. We're maybe making suggestions on top of what they're already doing. We talked about housing, right? Really gathering information and options, maybe already applying for those things, already looking for what area she wants to be in with her kids, already just thinking it through before coming into shelter. Maybe we're talking about legal. Maybe we're giving her a legal consult for divorce, and help letting her go through the options of what it would mean for her custody situation or for her living situation or anything there before she leaves. A lot of times we are prepping with our Genesis legal team, so they may pick up a client for full representation for divorce and custody and all of this. We know that the moment she applies for divorce, it's going to be a potential escalation of violence because he's going to be pissed that she filed for divorce. So a lot of times we're coordinating with legal and they'll say, okay, he's going to be served divorce papers in 2 weeks. And so again, I can go, oh, okay, so then I have an exit on this date. Let's plan to bring her in the day before he gets filed. But that's still giving us 2 weeks to work on all these things that we're talking about so that when she comes in, then we're filing for divorce and waiting for the courts, but we're also all still ahead on all of these things. That's not eating up the 8 weeks that she has with us, right? Does she need to know the information about custody of her children? Before she leaves these 4 walls and a roof, does she know what it means in regards to custody? Does she know that in majority of our states, he will still get unsupervised visitations with those kids? She will still have to give them over to him every other weekend and have them go to his house where she has no control. She has no idea what they're going through, no ability to protect them or make sure they're being fed or make sure they're on a routine and going to bed. Does she know that that's potentially going to happen? Because just to be really blunt with you guys, she has the right to make the decision of whether or not she's going to leave and be in this custody situation for herself. She may decide, and I've had clients who have decided, you know what, all of this is true about the abuse, but I'm going to choose to stay so that I have my kids with me every single day and I have control over them and I can protect them from what I'm fearful that he's going to do. That might be a part of her decision making, and she has the right to make that decision. Of course, the caveat to that is if these kids are experiencing abuse and if there are ways in which the impact of this is detrimental, which is hard to say because all of the violence is hurtful to the kids, right? 100% kids living in an abusive home are experiencing trauma, but I'm just suggesting that she gets to make this decision for herself. In before she's leaving, are we considering what kind of support she really needs from a social emotional perspective as much as a literal financial, literal housing, literal advocacy case management perspective? Because that support is going to be so imperative to her emotional stability, her mental stability. This process, and again, acknowledging he becomes more dangerous after she's left. There potentially are more barriers after leaving. And so because of that, she, the trauma symptoms may increase after she's leaving. She's going to need support. And so if leaving means she will have to leave behind friends and family members and people who were sort of, for lack of a better word, supportive of her. It doesn't mean the support was perfect, but they were before. If they're going to no longer talk to her anymore, or she thinks they are no longer safe for her to talk to, unfortunately, and becomes more isolated, we may need to talk about supportive resources before she leaves. We may need to talk about community groups that she could be a part of, community groups that her kids could be a part of, support groups or group therapy that our agency could offer to support her through this. She may need to start processing the grief of all of this. The reality of leaving domestic violence means she's losing everything. She's losing the house that she has worked really hard to make comfortable and a home. And maybe even though those four walls and a roof contained her abuser who was abusive, maybe it also had that couch and that corner of the couch that she sat in every day and every morning with her coffee cup. And that was comforting to her. And she had that quiet moment and that was good to her. She's losing that couch and that corner of that couch. Maybe she's losing the garden that she worked hard to build. Maybe she's losing the neighbor 2 doors down that always waved to her. So in my neighborhood, there's this old guy who walks his dog every morning, and the dog is really old too. Really old guy, really old dog. They walk really slowly. And every morning we seem to cross the paths in the street where at the same time. And so I wave to him every morning. He waves to me every morning. I would be so sad to lose my morning wave, right? That would be a part of my grief. The reality of what I'm losing would be my morning wave. I'm losing that, right? Maybe she's losing her pets. Maybe she has dogs or cats and the shelter in your area doesn't take animals into their shelter. To be really honest with you, it's hard for shelters to take pets. There's a lot of liability issues. There's a lot of logistics around people having pets in shelter. And so it's not that shelter directors are animal haters. It's that it's really complicated to have pets come in. So maybe they've decided that we don't do pets. She can't bring her pets. And so in order to leave, she's got to leave her animal behind. I know a lot of us consider our fur babies to be a part of our family. So what would it be like to lose that, to not have that anymore? And so maybe we need to support her with that. Maybe we need to look up options for her pet so that she can feel comfortable or more okay with where her pet's going to be before she leaves, right? So let me go. So I saw something about slides. Yes, we can email out these. Actually, I'm saying yes, Lacey, I'm assuming there's a way we might be able to send these to everybody. But I would be more than happy to share them as I'm able to. And then what I'll do just to be proactive in this moment, I'm going to put my email in the chat box right now so that if you would like to reach out to me about any more information, if you have a hard time with the slides, getting the slides, or if anything else, then you can have my email information to reach out to, and we can talk more if that would be helpful. So in this whole presentation, again, it's been repetitive. I know I've said it over and over. If you'll just bear with me, you've only got, what, 12 minutes left with me? If the whole point of this presentation is to really get you to slow down and question whether or not shelter is the best referral for every victim. If I'm doing that by just acknowledging the realities of shelter, good or bad, if I'm doing that by suggesting that the shelter referral is kind of what the movement came from, we had to get her out and hide her. I shared that history with you to demonstrate that our movement came from legally there were no options, so you had to get her out and hide her. But a lot of our shelters are still in this get her out and hide her, don't disclose the location mentality, and it might not be necessary anymore because we have more legal options now. We have more agencies now who might be supportive in different areas. We have more options potentially now. If we're having a big conversation about that whole thing and trying to really slow down and say, does she need to go to shelter at all? Does she need to go to shelter now? Maybe in a really uncomfortable way for us, but more importantly, of course, for her, maybe she needs to stay in these four walls and a roof longer while we prep and plan for all of this. At the same time, I can't help but take a moment and just say, but shelters will still be needed. I am the Chief Residential Officer of Genesis, who is presenting as often as possible, hey, maybe you don't send your friend or your sister or your client to the shelter, but I'm still going to keep the shelter doors open. Shelters are still going to be necessary because there are still going to be moments where she had to get out that night in order to remain alive, right? We took in a client last night who came in with some really bad injuries and some broken ribs and things like that. And she came in through the Dallas Police Department because of the lethality assessment or danger assessment. DPD was called because she jumped out of the car that he was driving, and then he pulled over and was arguing with her to get into the car. And thankfully, somebody saw and was able to call 911. So DPD came and talked to them. They did the lethality assessment, and the lethality assessment said that this person is at high risk of being murdered by this abuser. And so that's a situation where it's like, no, we need to help her stay alive. She needs to come to shelter, right? Maybe shelter has to be her first step. Maybe like I was suggesting in the first and the last slide about exit planning, maybe shelter is a part of the plan. Maybe it's the first step of the plan, but it's not the whole plan, right? Maybe we're being very strategic in planning for before and after shelter, not just planning for shelter, right? The truth is too, a lot of us have rural clients that we're supporting. Maybe you're from a rural area and you don't have a shelter in your area. I serve rural clients that come from pretty far because they don't have a shelter in their area. So I just want to be aware of the fact that sometimes clients have to come to shelter because it's the only way for them to get the intervention, to get access to the advocate or the counselor, to get the information, because it might not be in their community, or they might not be able to make the appointment, literally driving back from the appointment. In that situation, I would highly suggest you to explore telehealth options, being able to offer your counseling services and your advocacy services via telehealth. Genesis does this. About 75% of our services are in person at our non-residential center. About 25% of them are offered over Zoom calls and phone calls to be able to provide this information if she can't come in, right? But maybe she doesn't have a way of participating in a Zoom call. Maybe she doesn't have a vehicle to be able to come in. Maybe literally the only way she can take a step out of this situation is to come into shelter. And so in that situation, I would argue, yeah, we got to do something, get her in. Like let's call the hotline, let's call the shelter and see how they can get her in and support her, right? I'm also going to take just 2 minutes, if you'll allow me to gently talk to shelter directors within this call and make a couple of suggestions. I'm really going to encourage you to really identify within your programming, how are you providing trauma-informed care? Trauma-informed meaning that you recognize the impact of what has happened to her, that this was not a choice to go through these things or a choice to be impacted in this way from these things, that is something that happened to her. And so how are you considering the different dynamics of your rules or your guidelines or how you're doing things, and how that it might be creating trauma triggers and or power and control dynamics? I'll give you an example. I hope that this doesn't blow up the chat box and you all lose your mind, but when I became shelter director, one of the first things that I did was I took away chores. Our clients no longer do any chores. It was one of the main areas that there were power and control conflicts between staff and clients, because clients weren't doing chores, so we were arguing with them, or because they weren't doing the chore good enough for the staff member. The staff member didn't think they did the chore good enough. It was a constant area of conflict and power and control issues. So I took it away and I said, to be more trauma informed, we're going to do the cleaning. They're not going to do any chores, and we're going to take that away so that we can be more available relationally. We can gain their trust more. We can give them more time to rest and for their brains and the stress that they're experiencing to calm and release. And then hopefully they'll be more effective in their case management appointments and their counseling appointments. I'm going to encourage you to be transparent from the time that they call your shelter. What is the conversation that you're having on the phone before they come into shelter about what your shelter is, what the expectations are, what the length of stay is, what's gonna happen if they don't have anywhere to go at the end of it, right? Are you talking to them about the fact that we cannot let them stay forever and until they get the next housing? So again, I told you about the number of calls my hotline gets a day. We say no to roughly around 70 individualized victims of domestic violence a day. We say no to shelter because we're full, because we do not have bed space. We say no roughly on average around 70 times a day. And so in that, I really, in my 8 weeks, I'm having to balance more time needed for this group of people, but the number of no's I'm saying daily who are in immediate danger. And so a lot of times what I'm saying is, I gotta stay with 8 weeks. I gotta only offer 8 weeks and help you get to the next safe place, because I gotta help these 70 women get to this safe place first so that they even have that first opportunity to get things moving forward, right? But I wanna be honest about that in the phone call. How are you cultivating relationships with housing programs? What are your referrals? And do you have relationships and connections so that you know that the referral to the next place is going to be effective, that you have an awareness of what the application process is? There's a lot of housing programs in the DFW area. A lot of them have an application process that takes months. And so a lot of times that application process is longer than my shelter stay. I want to know that so that I can be transparent with the client, or I can be more strategic in when I'm encouraging her to apply. Maybe we're applying to the housing program before she came into shelter. Or maybe when she's in shelter, we're applying to the housing program, but I'm making sure that she knows it could probably take this long for you to get an answer. Your shelter exit is before then. I want you to be aware, right? Childcare is such a barrier to level. Have you considered how you might be able to support with childcare on site? Moms just can't work. They can't go to appointments. They can't do something different if they don't have that. Do you have any job readiness or path to employment programs? But to be honest with you, a lot of what I'm asking you to consider is whether or not you might need to reallocate some of your funding or attention, not away from shelter services so that shelter is necessarily less, but so that you could build up other areas of programming, your non-resident appointments. But really what I like to push a lot is transitional living. Our Annie's House program is our year-long, 6 months to a year-long program that allows for clients to stay with us and continue receiving advocacy and case management, continue experiencing counseling and occupational therapy, so that we're helping them in that more time that they need to get to stability. I'm encouraging you to look for ways that you could start transitional living programs in your community more than you're trying to expand how many shelter beds that you're offering. We know that system changes are needed. These are some ways, if we're talking to people who have influence over the movement, influence over our agencies and everything, we know that these are areas that have to be reformed and have to be improved, because shelter cannot fix this. And these areas have such an impact on whether or not she has a safe place to go after leaving shelter. I said that I would give you time for questions at the end, and we only have a couple of minutes. I apologize for that, but I just want to take a second and see if anybody does have any questions about anything that I've said, anything that didn't make sense, or you were looking for an answer to anything? Michelle, you saw chores were an issue too? Yeah, thank you. There were a lot of little rules that I just wanted to step back and go, okay, why does that rule exist? We had an elevator rule, guys. The elevator rule was that after, I think it was 9 p.m. because of quiet hours, you weren't allowed to use the elevator anymore, which is obviously problematic because, you know, those with mobility issues need it, or whatever. It was such a power and control thing to be like, you can't use the elevator. So I got rid of the elevator rule. So there's just a lot of those that the rule had always been, and I needed to step back and go, but why are we doing that? And is that trauma informed? Is that helping her? And kind of look at that. Let's see. We only have about 1 minute left. So like I said, here's my email address. That's our helpline. If you wanted to use this as a referral for your clients, please feel free to. We are within our helpline, we're able to provide information about our services, but we also make referrals. We do safety planning. We do domestic violence education. So you're more than welcome to refer. If you needed kind of a 24-hour number that you could provide to people in your area, you're more than welcome to provide victims in your area our helpline number. That's my email. If you have any other questions or any areas that I can support in, please feel free to contact me and see. I do consultation calls sometimes with shelters to talk about improvement in shelter services or things that you might be able to do, potentially something that I could do. But I do appreciate your time today and just your willingness to think about this and to consider whether or not as a whole movement we could be doing things a little bit differently to just be better for our women and children who deserve help and deserve safety. Thank you, Lacey, for inviting me and having me.
Thank you so much, Jordyn. I really appreciate some of the tough conversations. I see in the chat a lot of folks are saying the same thing. And so one of the things I will say about our program that I'm really proud of Jordyn and the other leadership that's involved is just questioning those things that we just kind of always taken for granted, that this is how we do shelter. And is it really the best way? So thank you again. And yes, I want to draw a couple of things to your attention, and then we will be respectful of your time. But we are doing a new event in South Padre. Jordyn will be there. Jordyn will be providing training. And so it's next week, or well, I guess a week and a half from now. September 30th and October 1st, we're going to be in South Padre Island in Texas. Come join us at the beach. We're going to have a great time. More information on our website there if you are interested. Our next webinar coming up in October is on adult forensic interviewing, what it is, how to implement a program in your area, that kind of thing. So we'd love for you to join us for that. And that information is on our website and registration is open now. And then finally, one of the things I'm super excited about and is that ICCR, as we mentioned before, is an OVW funded program. And we come alongside you for an intensive year of providing free training in your community in person, providing support and looking at your systemic response to domestic violence. And applications are open now for next year. So our cohort year starts in May. Your core team comes to conference for free 2 years in a row. And so if you want more information about that, feel free to reach out, or you can scan that, look on our website. And if you know of a rural community that may be interested, if you are on here and work for a national TA or you're with a state coalition, please consider sharing that throughout your state to give that information, because it's a great program. We're going to be selecting up to 4 sites for cohort year 2. And then there's my contact information. If you have any questions about the application process or anything else, feel free to reach out. And so immediately when you close out your browser, you should have a window pop open that gives you access to a survey. Once you complete the survey, you will get your certificate. And this will be on our website recorded, a recording of this. Hopefully in the next couple of days, we'll get that up along with a PDF of the slides. So Jordyn, thank you again for everything. Everybody have a great day. Thanks.